Hello fellow lovers of the liminal and the weird, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. Today we're going to continue on with our spooky season material, and we're going to be talking about one of the earliest vampire stories. This one predates Dracula by about 25 years, and that is Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. This is a Barnes & Noble edition of this book. I grabbed it just because I liked the look of it, and it's a really cool to have this novel in its own binding. Of course, this is not a long story. It is called a novel, but really it's closer to a novella, if you ask me. It's under, I think it's like 26,000 words. Anyway, beyond just its claim to fame as being the story that probably inspired a large chunk of Dracula, this is an incredible story in its own right. And I'm just going to do a quick synopsis here for you. No spoilers. Well, there'll be a little bit of the early novel spoilers, but nothing that you can't pick up the novel and still really enjoy it. So this novel opens with a young woman named Laura. And Laura lives in a castle in Styria with her father. There's the mother, I can't remember if she passed away, but the mother's not present. I think she did pass away. But the mother's not present. It's just Laura and her father absolutely loves her and dotes on her. And then I think a couple of governesses. And they live in this castle in Styria. It's beautiful. They have wonderful grounds, forests all around. There's the ruin of a town about 2 or 3 miles off, but really they're pretty isolated in this castle. Nobody lives in that city anymore. And then there's a town a few miles beyond that, I believe. And Laura has a wonderful family in her father and the 2 governesses, and wonderful surrounding, and they have all that they could really wish for, but they're very isolated, and Laura is very lonely. And so she's our narrator, Laura is, and she talks about a thing that happened to her when she was a little girl. She was young, and she was in her nursery and was sleeping, and she woke to find this beautiful woman in the room with her. And she very much remembers this person's face, and she had woken unhappy, and she was about to start screaming and crying because the one of the nursery maids that she was used to being in there wasn't in the room, and she was about to start screaming and crying, but then this woman was in her room, and this woman got in bed with her and laid with her and comforted her and made her feel much better. And she was just feeling good and happy about falling back asleep. And she started to drift off, and she feels 2 what feel like needles plunge into her chest. And she wakes up with a start, and this woman that was in bed with her seems to disappear under the bed. And she screams, and the nursery maid comes in. And that's the last. They can't find this woman that she talks about anywhere. So now she's 19. She's very lonely for company. And it's interesting because she is 19 years old, but she is still treated very much like a child. We could go into the concept of Victorian and the invention of childhood and all that, but we'll leave that for another time. By all intents and purposes, she still is treated as a child, even though she is 19. And she has been very excited because they are expecting a man named General Spilsdorf, and he is bringing his young ward. So she's going to get company from somebody her age, which is very exciting for her. And her dad takes her on a walk that evening and explains to her that this, unfortunately, he got a letter from General Spilsdorf that's just completely intense. He really hasn't been able to make heads nor tails of it, but they're not coming. And Edith is not coming either, and the reason is because Edith is dead, which is quite a shock at the beginning of this. and he gives this letter to Carmilla and lets her read it. And General Spilsdorf talks about, that Edith has died, and he's not going to be able to visit. His visit's going to have to be put off, and this saddens Carmilla. And then I think this happens on the same walk, if I remember correctly. Suddenly, this procession of coaches comes around the road that runs in front of the castle, and one of them crashes. And in this coach is a young woman and her mother, and the young woman is thrown from the coach, and everybody's worried about her and looking at her medically to make sure she's okay. And then they find out that she's going to be okay, but she's really shook up and should not travel. So the mom talks to Laura's dad and says, "Hey, I have to go. I'm in a situation for my family that demands that we keep going right now. The doctor has just said that my daughter Carmilla can't be moved for a couple of weeks. So I have to leave her here with you, and I need you to take care of her. And I need you to know that the business on which I'm dealing with for my family is very secretive, and Carmilla will not tell you anything about it, but I am leaving her with you, so please take care of her." And the mother leaves. The dad accepts, and the mother leaves. And Laura's really tickled by this. She's very excited because she's going to have somebody there her age. Eventually, after Carmilla has gone through some healing, Laura is able to meet her, and when she walks in, she is shocked to find that the young woman that is here, that is Carmilla, that is there for the next couple of weeks or months, really, looks exactly like the woman that was in her room when she had what she thought was the dream in her nursery so long ago. And that's about all I'm going to tell you now. That sets the scene for what is, in my opinion, one of the best vampire stories ever written. I am going to state directly, and I know that a lot of people will disagree with me on this, and that's okay. The world's wonderful by having so many different opinions. I like this better than Dracula. I enjoyed reading this much more than Dracula. I really did. Dracula is a classic, and I can't really say anything bad about it. It just never equaled this for me. It really didn't. I thought this had a lot more of the type of mystery and horror that I look for than Dracula did. Okay, so just before we get further into our themes and a little bit of a deep read, I wanted to just really quickly talk about the publication of this novel. Carmilla was written by Joseph Thomas Sheridan Le Fanu, who was an Irish writer who spent most of his life, I think, in the Dublin area. He was born August 28th, 1814, and died February 7th, 1873. The story Carmilla was first published in the magazine Dark Blue, or the Dark Blue magazine. This is a very short-lived magazine. I think it was like 1871 to 1873. But one of its calls to fame was that it was the first magazine to publish Carmilla. I looked for any physical copy of this magazine I could find on the internet. Any scan of the front, anything. I could not find anything. And of course, I have a specific amount of time I can set aside to researching these things. So maybe with more digging, I could find a copy of the cover of one of the issues of the Dark Blue that this was actually published in. But I couldn't find it in the time that I had allotted. If any of you are internet sleuths, I would love it if you could find a picture of one of these, a copy of this magazine. It would be really incredible. I was hoping to find some kind of copy of Carmilla from its time, and that's proved to be absolutely impossible. These do not sell cheap by any stretch of the imagination. So in this case, I don't have a really old copy of the time that I can hold up, which is what I usually like to do, but this is just way too old. So it was published the end of 1871. Well, serialized is what I should say. It was serialized from the end of 1871 to the beginning of 1872 in this magazine. And then Le Fanu edited it and published it in his final short story collection. It's the last story in the last short story collection that he published in his life. Carmilla is one of the last things he wrote, and that was published in a book called In a Glass Darkly. The closest I could get to a really kick-butt copy of In a Glass Darkly is the Folio Society release, and it is absolutely wonderful. Really beautiful copy with a monkey on the front. Now, this is a collection of short stories, most of them ghost stories that are absolutely wonderful. They all are connected through the idea that they are the papers left by a doctor that studied the occult. I've forgotten his name, but it's been a little while since I read this whole book. I did reread Carmilla specifically for this video, but not the entirety of this book. But let me tell you, this monkey makes sense in this, because one of the short stories, a man is being haunted by a ghost monkey. It's a really good read. This is some of the earliest ghost stories, quite a few of which M.R. James, who a lot of people say invented the English ghost story, was a big fan of. Really incredible art in this thing. Yeah, so this was his last publication. Let's see what the Carmilla art looks like. Carmilla as a panther. This was the last publication in his life. He died soon after in February of 1873 and left us just a truly incredible vampire story. Of course, it is 25 years later that Dracula was released, also by an Irishman, Bram Stoker, and a lot of people claim that Stoker took a lot of influence from Le Fanu and Carmilla, and that could absolutely be the case. I think that there's a lot of evidence to back up that case. However, if you look at the history of vampire literature, you can see steps all the way through. Byron, of course, wrote a fragment of a novel called A Vampire. Polidori, I think his name is. I'm sorry if I'm saying Polidori. John Polidori, I think his name is. But I also might be mispronouncing his name, sorry. He took that fragment and finished it and wrote The Vampire. And then, of course, Varney the Vampire was written before Carmilla. So there was a lot of writing about vampires going on, and a lot of them were bridging the gap between zombie and intellectual vampire, which I think when you go back in time, the more vampires resemble zombies, and what really starts to set them apart is making them into gentlemen, right? Where they're zombies that can still think, talk, and mingle in polite society. So I'm sure all of them were affected by these earlier vampire works that had been written. But I do think that there is a specific sexuality in this, and we're going to get into this later, that did inspire Dracula. This question, this idea that I think has stuck with vampires ever since this piece came out, really truly. I mean, we see it in Interview with the Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice, this sexuality of the vampires. And we see it through Twilight, even for the young adults. There was this kind of sexuality to the vampires. And maybe it's played out. I don't know. I'm looking forward to Nosferatu. The new one by the guy that did The Witch. I forgot his name, but yeah, that's going to be a new vampire, some new vampire media for us, although it is a remake of Dracula. So, so I don't know if that's finally the market for that has been completely flooded, but I think we see here a very early step in that process. So there's two reasons that I highly recommend you read this novel. Three, really. The first one is it's short. you could read it in a day, no problem. It is super fast. And you can find it. It's been anthologized a bunch of times. Of course, it was first anthologized in A Glass Darkly, and then it was anthologized in a lot of Le Fanu stuff. Here's something called The Diabolical Genius by Le Fanu. I just grabbed this. I went to a book sale yesterday from my local library, and this was there, and I just grabbed it because it's Le Fanu, and I was like, this must be another collection of short stories by him, but all it is 2 short stories from In a Glass Darkly. I don't know if I can call them short stories. 2 novellas from In a Glass Darkly, The Inn of the Flying Dragon and Carmilla, and then a condensed version of Uncle Silas. So really, truly, most of this book for me is useless because I don't read condensed works. But yeah, here you can see it was published, anthologized in Le Fanu's works over and over again. And of course, it's published in vampire fiction books over and over again. All these anthologies of vampires, of course, are going to contain this early story, Carmilla. The version that I read it in, because I didn't mind taking it all around with me, I don't want to destroy my really nice copies of the book, right? I read it in an anthology called Daughters of Darkness, Lesbian Vampire Stories. And it's one of the first ones in this. And it fits perfectly, and that's one of the themes that we're going to be talking about when we talk about Carmilla. So, the first reason, it's short. It's a really easy read. The second reason you should read this is it is an incredible, scary, spooky story. It's if you can divorce all the things you think about vampires from your head when you read this, and just imagine yourself as reading this in the 18th century when it came out, and not knowing what it was about, not knowing it was a vampire. The spookiness is absolutely incredible, because part of the reading experience would be the mystery of going, what is this thing? How is it that she saw this girl and knew that it was the girl from the dream she had as a youth, and all that mystery is really incredible. The prose in this is brilliant. It is so well done, and it's not hard to read. It's written in the 1870s, so it has a little bit of archaic cadence in the prose, but it's not hard to read. It's absolutely incredible, and the characters are very well done. Even the character of Carmilla is very well thought out, and you get little hints of her past, which are absolutely incredible. And the third reason I think you should read it is I think it has some incredible themes. The reason it's included in this anthology is because it really reads as a love story between Laura and Carmilla. It really does. Like they are more than friends. And the fact that this was written in the 1870s that's really incredible. I didn't expect to come across gay fiction from that early, and it's really, really very well done. However, it's also of its time. So there is this dual way of looking at this, where Laura is simultaneously enchanted and in love with Carmilla, but also disgusted and scared of Carmilla. But the real brilliant thing that Le Fanu does, and I think this is, in my opinion, the main theme that runs through this story, is she disgusted or terrified of Carmilla because of her feelings that at the time would be considered evil or sin, or is she disgusted because Carmilla is literally a wild animal that hunts her prey in a very specific way? And the book wavers back and forth between these two. I think you could sit down and read this as really homophobic, in the sense that Carmilla, or that Laura, I mean, and the way she feels about Carmilla and the way she writes about Carmilla point to a real hatred and disgust of her own feelings. Or you could read it as Le Fanu outlining very much the way that this vampire hunts, in that she obsesses with young women and falls in love with them, wants them to fall in love with her, almost in a way that they choose death. She wants her victims to love her so much that they're willing to die for her. And that is really interesting and really unique. And I think if anything rubbed off on Dracula, it's that idea, this concept of the vampire really truly falling in love with the victims and trying to make them love them, even though they are this ungodly, risen from the dead zombie. And I think that's really unique to Le Fanu. I think that's at least that's the first that I've come across it, and I find it really, really beautifully written. I cannot recommend this book enough. It's really incredible. You can find it really in almost any vampire anthology worth its salt, because it's so short to reprint. It's a wonderful read. I really think you'll enjoy it, and I highly recommend it to you for this spooky season. All right, I wanted to talk about at the end here the concept of visualizing this story, because of course it's been visualized quite a bit, and the first visualizations that it had were through the illustrations that were included with it in the magazine The Dark Blue. So there were two people that illustrated Carmilla, and of course it came out monthly. I don't know how many months it was, if it was 6 months or what. But there is a few pictures that are very associated with this story specifically. The ones that are the most popular are done by D.H. Friston. And of course you have one, I think that's probably the most famous, is this one. And this is an interesting picture because it is a part of the book that is only spoken of in passing. I believe this is Carmilla attacking Edith, and that is the general coming into the room and seeing this final attack that takes the life of his daughter or his ward. The next one, by the same author, shows Carmilla being awakened, and there's this kind of moment where she is still looking kind of beastly and vampiric in her bed here. And then there was another artist that did a picture, and that is M. Fitzgerald, and it's this picture here. I believe it's the moment when Laura is standing while the funeral procession goes by, and Carmilla hates the sound of Laura joining in and singing the hymns as they pass by. So these are the first kind of visual depictions of Carmilla, and there would be many more that followed. So Universal Pictures wanted to make a sequel to Dracula. They made Dracula's Daughter, which was loosely based off of Carmilla. Crypt of the Vampire was made later, starred Christopher Lee. Interestingly enough, none of them have been really faithful to the book. There was one made recently that I was very excited for, and I'm going to spoil this movie, so if you want to watch the newest version of Carmilla, make sure to watch it before watching the next part of this video. So this newest Carmilla, it was written and directed by Emily Harris, had the atmosphere that I would look for in a Carmilla redo. It was absolutely beautiful, and the director made a very interesting choice, and in order to tell you this choice, I have to spoil the entire film. So as I was watching this film, I kept expecting some really iconic scenes from the book to come up. Specifically Carmilla as the cat and so on and so forth. And I noticed that this film, while characters around Carmilla and Laura were constantly afraid Carmilla was a vampire, the film was not showing us Carmilla as the vampire. And it got to the end, and Laura and Carmilla are running away together and are found by this man. I can't remember if it's her father or a general from the town. I can't remember who it was, but anyway, he's like, Carmilla's a vampire, and Laura's like, are you sure? And he's like, we're totally sure. And then they just grab a stake and drive it through her heart. And I realized at that point what the director was doing. Earlier we talked about the theme, or the fact that as you read through this novel, it is hard to pin down why Laura is disgusted with Carmilla. Is it because of the fact that Carmilla is a vampire, or is it because of her feelings for Carmilla, which her society would never accept as okay? And I realized that the director of this film made a really bold choice, because when you watch Carmilla killed by having a stake driven through her heart, which would kill anybody, you slowly wonder, are they just killing this girl because she seduced another woman? And I think that was the point the director was trying to make. And although I was frustrated with the lack of supernatural in the movie up to that point, when I saw that, I thought it was really brilliant. I thought it was a really brilliant take on the Carmilla story to say that all the vampire nonsense is just there as a way for people to express their disgust with what is going on between these two women. I thought it was beautifully done. I still hope that someday there will be a more direct version of this novel filmed, just because I really like seeing movies that bring a book to life. And I think this book is a great candidate for it, because it's short enough that this could easily, 2.5 hours, 2 hours, 15 minutes is more than enough time to film this particular show. But I don't want to hate on that last Carmilla movie, because I actually was totally entertained, really loved it, and loved her unique take on Carmilla's vampirism. Whether it was even in existence at all was a really cool touch. But someday I do hope to see a very direct adaptation of this book. I know there's been a web series about this book. There's been so much stuff done. I spent a lot of time in Japan, and I specifically spent time in a place called Takarazuka, which is a small town kind of near Kobe and Osaka and Kyoto, in that triangle there, Takarazuka. And Takarazuka is famous for, I think they call it the Takarazuka Review, which is a theater troupe that is all women. So the men are played by women and the women are played by women. Kind of a response, as I always understood it, to the concept of traditional kabuki theater, where only men could act. The Takarazuka Review was like a modern feminine retake of theater. So you've got kabuki, it's all men, and Takarazuka, that's all women. And I remember often seeing posters that they were putting on the play Carmilla, and I wish I would have gone and seen it at least once. I saw a couple of their other performances, but I never saw Carmilla. But the book is very famous in Japan as being a very early text, a very early lesbian text. And Takarazuka, I think, is one of the reasons that it became famous for that. And I want to end with just saying one more time, it's a great spooky story. It's so worth it just for a good gothic vampire story. It's really incredible. Probably, yeah, I can easily say, well, there's Anne Rice and all that. My journey into liking vampire fiction was a bit strange. Like I've said a bunch of times, I got into horror when I was a teenager. All I read was horror fiction. That's it. Absolutely loved horror fiction when I was a teenager. But I was also very picky, and I really liked supernatural or mind-bending horror. I didn't just care for monster stories. And one of the things that I didn't really like when I was a teenager, that it took me a long time to get on board, was the zombie movies. Because to me, there was no depth, no mind-bending, haunting, supernatural spookiness. It was just monsters. Just a lot of monsters chasing people, which is not where my interest lies. And I felt like that was kind of true with vampires, that they were just a slight intellectual step up from zombies. So I wasn't a huge fan of them, and I will gladly admit that the vampire, Interview with the Vampire craze, I know that movie or that book was written in the 70s, but I swear its heyday was in the early 90s. Everybody was reading Interview with a Vampire in the early 90s. And that's when I read it. And that really flipped my view on vampires. I suddenly really liked vampires and started looking backwards to other vampire texts. So yeah, I've always had a slightly interesting relationship to vampire fiction. But if I had to say, I would say the balance of the mystery and the supernatural and the eroticism that I associate with vampire fiction is best expressed in this one. It's incredible. It is just a really fantastic book, and I highly recommend that you give it a read. All right, I think that's everything that I wanted to say about Carmilla, so I'm going to leave it there. We got more spooky season stuff coming up. Jason's doing Shudder this week. Look forward to that as a Thai horror movie. And I am working on reading The King in Yellow and some Ambrose Bierce short stories that inspired it. So that'll be next week. I'll be talking about Ambrose Bierce and Robert Chambers' The King in Yellow. So it's going to get spooky next week. All right, thank you very much for watching to the end. If you liked this, please click like. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe, because we'll be making a lot more of it in the future. Thank you so much for watching.